Anticipations disappointed, new plans, preparations to join the exploring party, departure from Fort Gibson, fording of the Verdigris, an Indian cavalier. The anticipations of a young man are prone to meet with disappointment. Unfortunately for the Count's scheme of wild campaigning, before we reached the end of our journey, we heard of the Osage hunters had set forth upon their expedition to the buffalo grounds. The young Count was still determined, if possible, to follow on the track and overtake them, and for this purpose stopped short at the Osage Agency, a few miles distant from Fort Gibson, to make inquiries and preparations. His traveling companion, Mr. L., stopped with him, while the commissioner and myself proceeded to Fort Gibson, followed by the faithful and voracious Tonish. I hinted to him his promises to follow the Count in his campaignings, but I found the little varlet had a keen eye to self-interest. He was aware that the commissioner, from his official duties, would remain for a long time in the country and be likely to give him permanent employment, while the sojourn of a Count would but be transient. The gasconading of the little braggart was suddenly, therefore, at an end. He spake not another word to the young Count about Indians, buffaloes, wild horses, but putting himself tactfully in the train of our commissioner, jogged silently after us to the garrison. On arriving at the fort, however, a new chance presented itself for a cruise on the prairies. We learned that a company of mounted rangers, or riflemen, had departed but 3 days previous to make a wild exploring tour from the Arkansas to the Red River, including a part of the Pawnee hunting grounds where no party of white men has yet penetrated. Here, then, was an opportunity of ranging over those dangerous and interesting regions under the safeguard of a powerful escort, protected too by privilege, for the commissioner, in virtue of his office, could claim the service of his newly raised corps of riflemen in the very country they were to explore, was destined for the settlement of some of the migrating tribes connected with his mission. Our plan was promptly formed and put into execution. A couple of the Creek Indians were set off expressed by the commander of Fort Gibson to overtake the Rangers and bring them into a halt under the commissioner, and his party should be able to join them. As we should have had a march of 3 or 4 days through a wild country before we could overtake the company of rangers, an escort of 14 mounted riflemen under the command of a lieutenant was assigned us. We sent word to the young Count and Mr. L. of the Osage Agency of our new plan and prospects, and invited them to accompany us. The Count, however, could not forego the delights he had promised himself in mingling with absolutely savage life. In reply, he agreed to keep with us until we should come upon the trail of Osage hunters, when it was his fixed resolve to strike off into the wilderness in pursuit of them, and his faithful mentor, though he grieved at the madness of the scheme, was too staunch a friend to desert him. A general rendezvous of our party an escort was appointed for the following morning at the agency. We now made all arrangements for prompt departure. Our baggage had hitherto been transported on a light wagon, but we were now to break our way through untraveled country, cut up by rivers, ravines, and thickets. For a vehicle of the kind would be a complete impediment. We were to travel on horseback in hunter style and with little encumbrance as possible. Our baggage, therefore, underwent a rigid and most abstemious reduction. A pair of saddlebags, and those by no means crammed, sufficed for each man's scanty wardrobe, and with his great coat were to be carried upon the steep road. The rest of the luggage was placed on pack horses. Each one had a bearskin and a couple of blankets for bedding, but there was a tent to shelter us in case of sickness or bad weather. We took care to provide ourselves with flour, coffee, and sugar, together with a small supply of salt pork for emergencies. For our main subsistence, we were to depend upon the chase. Such as our horses, as had not been tired out in our recent journey, were taken with us as pack horses, or supernumeraries. But as we were going on a long and rough tour where there would be occasional hunting, and where, in case of meeting with hostile savages, the safety of the rider might depend on the goodness of his steed, we took care to be well mounted. I procured a stout silver gray, somewhat rough but staunch and powerful, and retained a hardy pony which I had hitherto ridden, and which, being somewhat jaded, was suffered to ramble along with the pack horses, to be mounted only in case of emergency. All these arrangements being made, we left Fort Gibson on the morning of the 10th of October, and crossing the river in the front of it, set off for the rendezvous at the agency. A ride of a few miles brought us to the ford of a verdigris, a wild rocky scene overhung with forest trees. We descended to the bank of the river and crossed in straggling file. The horses stepped cautiously from rock to rock, and in a manner feeling about for a foothold beneath the rushing and brawling stream. Our little Frenchman Tanish brought up the rear with a pack of horses. He was in high glee, having experienced a kind of promotion. In our journey hitherto, he had driven the wagon, which he had seemed to consider a very inferior employ. Now he was master of the horse. He sat perched like a monkey behind the pack of one of the horses. He sang, he shouted, he yelped like an Indian, and ever and anon blasphemed the loitering pack horses in their jargon of mingled French, English, and Osage, which not one of them could understand. As we were crossing the ford, we saw opposite the shore of a Creek Indian on horseback. He had paused to reconnoiter us from the brow of a rock, and formed a picturesque object. In unison with the wild scenery around him, he wore a bright blue hunting shirt trimmed with scarlet fringe. A gaily colored handkerchief was bound round his head like something of like a turban. With one end hanging down beside his ear, he held a long rifle in his hand and looked like a wild arrow on the prowl. Our loquacious and ever meddling little Frenchman called out to him in his Babylonish jargon. But the savage, having satisfied his curiosity, tossed his hand in the air, turned the head of his steed, and galloping along the shore, soon disappeared among the trees.